In a world where a woman's worth is defined by her ability to bear heirs, Princess Leora is exiled for failing to fulfill her duty. But when an unexpected miracle occurs, and she finds herself carrying a child no one thought possible, everything changes. Now, she must face the wrath of her kingdom, the father who cast her aside, and a destiny she never imagined. Can love and acceptance bridge the gap between worlds? Or will her past destroy everything she holds dear? If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to this channel and give a thumbs up by liking the video. Now, let's jump into the story. Princess Leora stood before the grand crystal windows of her father's palace, gazing out at the twin moons of Zarnur as they slowly rose above the horizon. The skies had shifted from deep orange to a rich purple, the familiar colors of her home world, yet tonight felt different. A sense of unease settled in her chest as she touched the cool crystal surface, her fingers tracing the familiar contours. At 25, Leora had come to know this view well, but tonight, the sight of light. The moons was more than just the end of another day. It was the end of something far more significant. The weight of the day felt heavier, as if she were watching the last sunset of her life here. For years, she had been the kingdom's biggest disappointment. She wasn't meant to be. She had been born into the royal family, educated in the finest arts, and groomed for a position of influence. But one thing kept her from filling her role, something no one in her world could forgive. She had not borne an heir. To the people of Zarnur, this was unforgivable. The kingdom was built on a foundation of bloodlines and legacy, and a woman's worth was determined by her ability to produce children. Without children, she was nothing. And though Leora was smart, kind, and beautiful, she had failed to meet the singular, crucial expectation. She had tried. She had been married 3 times, each union arranged by the royal council. 3 different husbands, 3 different chances, each one failing to bring her the one thing her people demanded. She had not been able to give them an heir. And with each failure, the burden on her heart grew heavier. The whispers behind her back became louder. The laughter, though soft and behind closed doors, still found its way to her ears. She had been called a failure by the people who once adored her, and now she was nothing but a shame to her kingdom. The pressure of it all had made her feel small, insignificant. Through the tall windows, she could hear the sounds of raised voices down the hallway. Her father, King Varian, was arguing with his advisors again. She had heard the same argument over and over in recent months. They didn't know what to do with her. She wasn't fulfilling her purpose, and as the future of Zarnur depended on the royal bloodline, she had become a problem and obstacle in the kingdom's future. As she listened, she caught the familiar phrase she had dreaded: send her away. She knew what that meant. The humans from Terra, a distant world, had made an offer to send someone from the royal family to live with them and teach them about Zarnurian culture. At first, it seemed like a great honor, an opportunity for diplomacy and cultural exchange between 2 worlds. But Leora had heard rumors, whispers in the corridors, and now she knew for sure this wasn't an honor. This was exile. The humans had requested a royal ambassador, and she was the one who had been chosen, though in truth, she hadn't been chosen at all. She was the one they were getting rid of. Her younger sister Serena stepped into the room, the soft click of her shoes on the marble floor breaking the silence. Serena was everything Leora wasn't. She was a woman who had done everything right in the eyes of her people. She had married, had children too, with another on the way. Serena was loved by the people, respected, admired. Leora had always felt like a shadow in her sister's bright presence. Now, as Serena walked into the room with a pitying look in her eyes, Leora's heart sank. "Father wants to see you," Serena said gently, her voice soft but laced with sadness. Liora nodded, but didn't respond immediately. Serena's pity was worse than any angry words. She turned away from the window, her shoulders slumping as she whispered, "I know what he's going to say." There was no need to hear it aloud again. She had been preparing for this moment for months, though she had hoped for a different ending. Serena tried to offer comfort, but it didn't reach Leora's heart. "Maybe it won't be so bad," Serena said, her voice faltering. "The humans seem nice from what I've heard. You've always been curious about other worlds." Leora didn't turn around to face her sister. She couldn't bear the thought of pretending everything would be fine. "Don't pretend this is good news, Serena," she replied, her voice breaking. "We both know what this really is." Serena lowered her gaze, unable to argue. Leora's steps felt heavy as she made her way down the long corridor to the throne room. The palace had always been her home, a place where she had spent her childhood learning the ways of royalty and power. But now, the familiar halls felt cold, distant. The servants who passed her looked away quickly, as though ashamed to be in her presence. It was as though her shame might somehow be contagious, as though she carried the burden of her failure with every step she took. When she entered the throne room, King Varian was seated on his golden throne, his expression stiff, his eyes cold. He looked more worn than she had ever seen him, the burden of ruling and maintaining his legacy showing on his face. The advisors stood around him, silent, their disapproval clear in the air. When he addressed her, his voice was formal, as though she were a stranger, not his daughter. "You have heard about the humans' request?" he began, his tone indifferent. Leora nodded, her throat tightening. "I've heard," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "You will go to Terra as our representative," King Varian continued. "You will teach them about Zarnar's ways and learn theirs." "It is a great honor." Leora knew what he meant. She had been sent away to live among strangers, to be a foreign ambassador, far from her people, far from her home. "How long will I be gone?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "As long as necessary," her father said. "Forever, perhaps." There was nothing more to say. She wasn't wanted here anymore. She was being cast out. There was no place for someone like her in Zarnar anymore. "I understand," she said simply, her voice devoid of emotion. It wasn't worth arguing. What choice did she have? With no future left in her own kingdom, perhaps she would find something on Terra, something that might offer the purpose she had been denied here. And so, the princess who had once been adored, whose every action had been scrutinized by her people, would now leave everything behind. She would journey to Terra, a stranger in a world that was as unfamiliar as the loneliness in her heart. It was exile, but in some small way, it felt like freedom. The journey to Terra was long and unrelenting. Leora sat alone in the spacious confines of the ship, staring out at the vast emptiness of space. For months, she had been confined to this vessel, her only companions the cold walls and the faint hum of the engine. The ship was a marvel of technology, capable of traveling across galaxies, but to Leora, it felt like a prison. She had no connection to the people who worked aboard, no comfort in the quiet camaraderie of the crew. They were just figures moving in the background of her life, and she was just a princess being sent away. Every day felt like a slow march toward an unknown future, and with each passing moment, Leora felt herself growing more and more detached from everything she had once known. The ship's windows offered glimpses of the universe outside, stars far away, planets she couldn't recognize, and the endless blackness of space. It was beautiful in its own way, but the beauty did little to ease the emptiness she felt inside. She thought about Zarnar often, about the life she had left behind, the people who had once adored her and now shunned her for her inability to fulfill the one thing they expected of her. They had sent her away, not as a princess or a representative, but as a failure. When the ship finally reached Terra's solar system, Leora couldn't help but feel a spark of curiosity deep in her heart. Terra was unlike anything she had ever seen. It was a world filled with blue oceans and vast green lands, the air thick with the scent of life. Her people had once spoken of Terra, but the descriptions had always been vague, full of wonder and mystery. Now, as she looked down at the planet through the ship's viewing windows, she felt both nervous and intrigued. What kind of place was this? What kind of people would welcome her, the exiled princess? The ship docked at a space station orbiting Terra, and Leora was escorted off the vessel by the captain, Nathaniel Clark. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with an expression that suggested he had seen his fair share of strange things in his career. He led her to a small shuttle that would take her to the surface. As they descended toward Terra, Leora marveled at the planet's beauty. She could see vast stretches of oceans, forests, and cities sprawling across the continents. The air was different here, thick and alive with the scent of plant life and the faint hum of human activity. Everything was unfamiliar, but there was a certain warmth in it that made her feel, for the first time in a long while, like she wasn't entirely alone. When they landed in the city of Silver Spring, Leora was greeted by Alara Taylor, a human woman with kind eyes and an even kinder smile. Alara was part of an Earth-based organization dedicated to intergalactic relations, and she had been assigned to oversee Leora's stay. She spoke softly, her voice calm and welcoming as she introduced herself and led Leora through the bustling streets. Leora couldn't help but notice how different this world was from her own. People here walked with a sense of purpose, but there was also an ease about them, a carefree attitude that was foreign to her. In Zarner, there was always a sense of tension, of rigid structure. Here on Terra, the world seemed alive with possibility. Alara took Leora to a small, modest apartment in the heart of the city. It was a far cry from the lavish rooms in the palace back on Zarner, but there was something comforting about its simplicity. The walls were lined with bookshelves, and a small garden of flowers sat on the balcony. The plants were nothing like the ones Leora had known on Zarner. These flowers were vibrant, with colors she had never seen before. Alara explained that she had planted them to make Leora feel at home, knowing how difficult the transition would be. The gesture, though small, made Leora feel something she hadn't in a long time, a sense of care. The first few weeks were a blur of adjustment. Leora struggled to understand the strange customs of the humans, and every interaction felt like an obstacle. Their food tasted strange to her, the textures unfamiliar and foreign. She had trouble understanding their language, a strange combination of sounds and rhythms that didn't seem to match her own tongue. But Alara was patient, teaching her the basics, guiding her through every step. The humans were different, yes, but they weren't unkind. They seemed to see her as a person first, not as the failed princess of a distant world in the quiet moments. When Leora had time to reflect, she found herself wondering what she had truly been sent here to do. Was this exile? Was it punishment? Or was it something else entirely? As she spent more time with Alara and the people around her, Leora started to feel something new, something she had never allowed herself to feel before. Perhaps there was a future for her here, far from the expectations and limitations of her home world. Maybe she wasn't as lost as she had thought. Her days began to fall into a rhythm. She spent her mornings learning about human culture, studying their history, their values, their traditions. Alara introduced her to various people in the city, and each interaction revealed more about the lives of the humans. Leora was fascinated by their way of life. They had no strict expectations for women, no rigid structures that dictated their value. Here, a person's worth was determined by their ideas, their creativity, and their ability to contribute to the world. It was liberating. But it was also overwhelming. She had never been taught to think this way. On Zarner, a woman's worth was defined by her ability to give birth, to continue the royal line. Here, that was just one small part of who a person was. The realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. Leora also began to spend more time with Dr. Adrian Wright, a human scientist who had been assigned to study her species. He had a quiet curiosity about her, asking questions about her biology and her culture, eager to learn more. Over time, his questions became less scientific and more personal. He wanted to understand her Leora, not the princess, not the exiled. 1. And for the first time in years, someone saw her for who she was, not for what she had failed to do. As the weeks turned into months, Leora began to feel more at home in this strange new world. The pain of exile didn't vanish overnight, but the fear that had clung to her every step began to fade. Maybe Terra wasn't so bad after all. Maybe, just maybe, this could be the beginning of something new. Asterisk. As the months passed on Terra, Leora began to feel a sense of something she hadn't known in years. Acceptance. At first, it was a small feeling, barely noticeable amidst the daily challenges of adjusting to a world so different from her own. But as time went on, the feeling grew. She wasn't the exiled princess here. She wasn't defined by the failures of her past, or the weight of a society that had cast her aside. In Terra, she was just Leora, and for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. Her life had settled into a new routine. Every day was filled with lessons and discoveries. Alara, ever patient, helped Leora navigate the intricacies of human culture. She learned about their history, their values, and the importance they placed on individuality. Unlike Zarner, where people were defined by their roles, their duties, and their ability to conform, the humans of Terra celebrated diversity, creativity, and the freedom to choose one's path. It was a world where one's worth was not determined by their ability to bear children or fulfill a rigid role. It was determined by who they were as a person. Leora began to see the world through a new lens. She could think, speak, and act for herself free from the constraints of her past. The more Leora learned about the humans, the more fascinated she became. Their society was full of contradictions, complex and simple at the same time. She found their willingness to question everything refreshing. In Zarner, everything had been decided for her long before she had the chance to form her own opinions. But here, people debated, discussed, and disagreed. It was a world of constant change, and that gave Leora a sense of possibility she had never known. The humans valued ideas, they valued learning, and most importantly, they valued each other. As individuals, she wasn't seen as a failure here. She was seen as a person with her own unique perspective, one that could teach them about her world, and perhaps, in the process, help her learn more about herself, despite the warmth and kindness of the humans. Around her, Leora had days when the pain of her past would resurface. She missed the familiar sights of Zarner, the palace gardens, the library where she had spent countless hours learning about distant worlds. She missed the idea of belonging, of being part of something greater than herself. But whenever these feelings crept in, she would remind herself that Terra was her chance for something new, something beyond the expectations that had once suffocated her. Here, she had the freedom to explore who she truly was, without the constant pressure to prove her worth through the one thing she could never give. An Heir. As she spent more time with Alara, Leora's understanding of herself deepened. Alara had become more than just a guide. She was a friend, someone Leora could talk to without fear of judgment. Alara shared stories of her own struggles, her own journey to find a place in a world that often seemed confusing and overwhelming. The bond between them grew stronger with each passing day. Leora realized that Ilara didn't pity her, nor did she see her as a burden. She saw her as a person with value, someone who could contribute to the world in ways that went far beyond what she had been taught to believe. One afternoon, as they sat in the small garden on the balcony of Leora's apartment, Ilara spoke of the importance of self-acceptance. "You don't need to prove anything to anyone," Ilara said, her voice calm and reassuring. "Your worth isn't determined by what others think of you, or by what you can give to them. It's defined by who you are, by the choices you make, and by the love you give and receive." Leora had never heard words like these before. On Zarner, the only love that mattered was the love of the people for the royal family, the love that came from fulfilling a duty. But here, on Terra, love was something different. It was a connection, an understanding between individuals that didn't require anyone to change who they were. Leora started to allow herself to believe that maybe she could find happiness without fulfilling the expectations of her past. Perhaps for once, she could live for herself. As she spent more time with Ilara and other humans, she began to feel something else she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Maybe she could have a future here, a future that didn't revolve around the strict expectations of her world. Maybe her worth wasn't tied to her ability to bear children. Maybe there was more to life than just fulfilling the role she had been given. Her relationship with Dr. Adrian Wright also began to evolve. Initially, their conversations had been focused on her species and the scientific aspects of her biology. But as they spent more time together, Leora began to feel something deeper. Adrian treated her with respect and kindness, not as a subject to be studied, but as a person with her own thoughts, feelings, and desires. He listened to her, asked questions about her culture, and genuinely wanted to understand her. For the first time, Leora felt like someone cared for her as an individual, not as a failure or a disappointment. Adrian's interest in her was not scientific but personal. He wanted to know her story, to learn about her dreams and her fears. Leora, in turn, found herself opening up to him in ways she never had before. She shared stories of her childhood, of the dreams she had once held for her future, and of the pain she had felt when she realized she could never give her people the one thing they wanted most. Adrian listened, never judging, always offering understanding. And in his presence, Leora began to see herself differently. She wasn't the broken princess who had failed her people. She was Leora, a woman with her own hopes, her own fears, and her own potential. One evening, as they sat together in the garden, Leora realized something profound. She didn't need to be what others expected her to be. She didn't need to bear an heir to prove her worth. Here on Terra, she was enough just as she was. And for the first time in her life, Leora felt a sense of peace. The past was behind her, and the future, though uncertain, was filled with possibilities she had never dared to imagine. She was free. And that was more than she had ever thought she could be. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Leora embraced her new life with a sense of excitement she had never known. She no longer saw herself as a failure. She saw herself as someone with the power to shape her own destiny. And in that freedom, she found not just acceptance, but a discovery of who she truly was, a woman, not defined by the past, but by the choices she made and the love she had found along the way. The weeks that followed Leora's discovery of peace on Terra were nothing short of transformative. She had found a place where she could breathe, where she could exist outside the crushing expectations that had defined her life back on Zarner. She was no longer the broken princess, the disappointment of her people. Here, she was simply Leora, a woman in charge of her own fate. She spent her days teaching humans about her world, sharing stories of Zarner's rich culture, and engaging in the kind of deep discussions that she had never had the chance to explore before. Her heart felt lighter, her spirit freer. It was in this newfound peace that something she never thought possible began to stir inside her. One day, after a routine medical checkup, Leora began to feel something unusual and unsettling nausea. That had no clear explanation. At first, she brushed it off, attributing it to the stress of her travels, or perhaps the strange food she had been eating. But as the days went by, the symptoms persisted. She found herself feeling strangely fatigued, and certain smells seemed to make her stomach churn. It was as if her body was telling her something she couldn't quite understand. Ilara, always observant and kind, noticed the change in Leora and insisted she see a doctor. At first, Leora hesitated. She didn't want to trouble anyone with what seemed like an inconsequential matter. But when the nausea worsened, she relented. Dr. Adrian Wright, the human scientist who had grown to care for her deeply, agreed to conduct a thorough examination. As he ran tests and monitored her condition, his expression grew more serious. He didn't want to say it out loud, not until he had the full results. But there was something about the way he looked at her that made Leora's heart race with anxiety. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was happening, something beyond what she could explain. Finally, the results came in. The words seemed to hang in the air as Dr. Wright looked at the data, his face a mixture of shock and wonder. "Leora," he said, his voice soft but filled with awe, "you're pregnant." The words struck her like a bolt of lightning, leaving her speechless. Pregnant? How could this be possible? She had been told all her life that she was infertile, that she could never bear children. It was the reason her people had dismissed her, the reason she had been sent away. For years, she had carried the weight of that belief, the shame of being unable to fulfill the one expectation that had been placed upon her. And yet, here she was, carrying a child. A human child, no less. The shock of the revelation hit her like a tidal wave. She wasn't sure what to feel: joy, fear, confusion. It seemed impossible, even though the evidence was right there in front of her. She looked at Adrian, who was watching her closely, his eyes filled with concern and something else: hope. This wasn't just a medical discovery. It was something that could change everything. It could change her, change the future of Terra and Xar Norgot. As Leora processed the news, her mind raced. What would this mean for her future? What would it mean for her child? The implications were staggering. She had already been exiled once, cast aside by her people for her inability to fulfill her duty. Now, she was carrying a child that was part human, part Zarnorian. Would her people ever accept it? Could she even accept it? She had spent so many years trying to prove her worth through the lens of her failures that the idea of being a mother felt both overwhelming and beautiful. The most pressing thought in her mind was one she couldn't shake. What would her father think? King Varian, her once proud father, had rejected her when she could not give him an heir. He had sent her away as though she were no more than a discarded object. How would he react when he learned of this pregnancy, this child that carried both her blood and the blood of a human? Leora's thoughts were interrupted by communication from Zarner. The message was brief but direct. The king had been informed of her pregnancy, and he demanded her immediate return. The message continued with threats against her and her unborn child. The words stung, more painful than she could have imagined. Her father, the king who had once loved her, now saw her as an abomination. He had declared that the child she carried must be eliminated, that the impurity in her bloodline was an insult to the Zarnorian throne. The pain of hearing her father's voice again, filled with such hatred and disdain, almost broke her. How could he be so cruel? How could he condemn her and the innocent life she was carrying without even seeing them? But the words were clear. King Varian would stop at nothing to make her return to Zarner, even if it meant sending forces to Terra to retrieve her by force. The message ended with a chilling promise. If she did not comply, the consequences would be dire. As the days passed, the tension between Terra and Zarnor grew. Warships from Zarnor arrived on the edge of the solar system, a silent threat hovering. In the dark expanse of space, Liara knew her time on Terra was running out. But as she stood by the window in her apartment, her hand resting on her belly, she realized something she hadn't before. She would not let her father take her child. She would not allow the child she had carried with so much love to be destroyed by the pride and prejudice of a world that had cast her aside. Adrian stood by her side, his hand gently squeezing hers. He had been her rock in this chaotic storm, and now he was ready to stand with her no matter what came next. Together, they would find a way to protect this child, to prove that love and acceptance could overcome the barriers that had kept their worlds apart for so long. The final confrontation loomed ahead. Liara knew that she would have to face her past, face her father and the royal court that had rejected her. But this time, she would not be the broken princess, the disappointment. This time, she would fight for the life she had built, for the life growing inside her, and for the future she could finally see. It was a future where love, not bloodlines, would define her worth. The battle for her child had only just begun.